The gunshots echoing from the saloon made Ruby McGrath flinch as she counted her meager coins for the third time, knowing they wouldn't be enough to save the small cabin she called home. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool autumn breeze sweeping through Redding, California in 1876, a town caught between its mining past and uncertain future, much like Ruby herself. $32.17, she whispered, staring at the pathetic pile. Her rent was $50, due tomorrow, and Mr. Perkins had made it abundantly clear there would be no extensions this time. Ruby tucked the money back into her worn leather pouch and pulled her shawl tighter. 6 months ago, her father had passed away unexpectedly, leaving her with nothing but debts and the small cabin they'd rented since arriving in California 3 years earlier. At 22, Ruby had managed to find work at Mrs. Wilson's seamstress shop, but her wages barely covered food, let alone rent. As she walked down Redding's Main Street, the setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty road. Men stumbled in and out of saloons while merchants closed their shops for the day. Ruby kept her eyes fixed on the ground, careful to avoid any unwanted attention. Miss McGrath. She turned to see Mr. Perkins himself, her landlord, hurrying across the street toward her. His round face was flushed with exertion, and his eyes darted around nervously before settling on her. "I was just coming to see you," he said, smoothing his vest. "I trust you have my money ready. Tomorrow's the 1st of the month." Ruby swallowed hard. "Mr. Perkins, I am afraid I'm a bit short this month." His expression hardened. "How short?" "I have $32, she admitted. "I can get the rest by next week, I promise." "Mrs. Wilson says there's a big order coming in from—" "Next week won't do," Perkins interrupted. "I've been more than patient, Miss McGrath. 3 months of late payments is quite enough. I have expenses too, you know." "Please," Ruby said, hearing the desperation in her own voice. "Just a few more days." Perkins shook his head. "I'm sorry, but if you don't have the full amount by noon tomorrow, I'll have no choice but to evict you. I already have another family interested in the property." Ruby felt her throat tighten. "But where will I go?" "That's not my concern," Perkins replied, though he at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Business is business." As Perkins turned to leave, a tall figure stepped forward from the boardwalk where he'd apparently been listening to their exchange. "Excuse me," the man said, his deep voice causing both Ruby and Perkins to look up. Ruby had noticed him around town the past few days, hard not to, really. He stood over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a quiet confidence that set him apart from the rowdy miners and drifters that frequented Redding. His dark hat shadowed his face, but she could see his strong jawline and the slight stubble that lined it. "Mr. Perkins, is it?" the stranger asked. "Yes," Perkins replied cautiously. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. "How much did you say the lady owes you?" $17.83, Perkins answered, his eyes widening as the stranger counted out exactly that amount. "Will this settle her debt for the month?" the man asked, holding out the money. Perkins stared at the cash, then back at the tall stranger. "Yes, but who are you to her?" "Just a man who pays his debts and expects others to do the same," he replied evenly. "The lady said she'd have your money next week. Seems to me a few days' grace isn't too much to ask." Ruby stared in shock as Perkins reluctantly took the money, counted it, then tipped his hat awkwardly before hurrying away. "Thank you," Ruby managed to say once Perkins was gone. "But why would you do that? You don't even know me." The stranger finally lifted his face fully into the fading light, and Ruby found herself looking into the most intense blue eyes she'd ever seen. "Zachary Vance," he said, tipping his hat. "And I've found that kindness needs no introduction, Miss McGrath." Ruby, she replied automatically. Ruby McGrath. She clutched her shawl tighter. I insist on paying you back, Mr. Vance. Every cent. The faintest smile touched his lips. I've no doubt you will. He gestured toward the general store that was just closing. May I walk with you a bit? These streets get rowdy this time of evening. Ruby hesitated. While she was grateful for his help, she'd learned to be wary of men bearing unexpected gifts, yet something in his steady gaze reassured her. I'm actually headed home, she said. But I wouldn't mind the company to the corner of Shasta and Pine. They walked in silence for a moment, the sounds of piano music and laughter spilling from the saloons providing a strange backdrop to Ruby's tumbling thoughts. You're new to Reading, she finally said, not a question but an observation. Arrived last week, Zachary confirmed. I've been looking to settle somewhere quiet after too many years on the move. And what brings a man like you to a small mining town like ours? Zachary adjusted his hat. Land, mostly. Looking to start a cattle operation. There's good grazing in these hills and the railroad makes shipping possible. Ruby nodded. The Northern California Railroad had brought prosperity to Reading, though not everyone had benefited equally. You're a rancher, then? She asked. Been working other men's herds since I was 16, he said. Figured it was time to run my own spread. Bought a parcel about 5 miles east of town. As they reached the corner of Shasta and Pine, Ruby stopped. This is where I turn. Thank you again, Mr. Vance. Not just for the money, but for the escort as well. Zachary, please, he said. And it was my pleasure, Miss McGrath. Ruby, she reminded him with a small smile. Ruby, he repeated, and something about the way he said her name made her cheeks warm. Would you allow me to call on you properly sometime? Perhaps Sunday after church. The question caught her by surprise. It had been a long time since anyone had shown interest in calling on her. After her father fell ill, Ruby had retreated from what little social life Reading offered, focusing instead on survival. Yes, she found herself saying. I'd like that. Zachary smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. Until Sunday, then. He tipped his hat once more before turning back toward town. Ruby watched him go, unsure whether to be grateful for his timely intervention or worried about what he might expect in return. She had learned the hard way that in the West, very few things came without strings attached. The following day, Ruby worked with renewed vigor at Mrs. Wilson's shop, her hands flying across the fabric as she repaired a torn dress for one of the saloon girls. My goodness, child, Mrs. Wilson said, peering over her spectacles. What's lit a fire under you today? Ruby smiled without looking up. Just trying to earn my keep, Mrs. Wilson. The older woman snorted. Well, keep at it and I might be able to offer you more hours next week. The Brewster wedding has half the town ordering new clothes. By late afternoon, Ruby's fingers were cramped, but she had earned an extra $1 a start toward repaying Zachary Vance. As she prepared to leave, the bell above the shop door jingled, and she looked up to see Sheriff Tom Bailey entering. Afternoon, ladies, he said, removing his hat. Ruby, got a minute? Ruby exchanged a glance with Mrs. Wilson, who nodded for her to go ahead. She stepped outside with the sheriff, anxiety churning in her stomach. Is something wrong, Sheriff? Bailey shook his head. Just thought I'd give you a friendly word about that stranger who helped you out yesterday. Ruby stiffened. You mean Mr. Vance? Yeah, Zachary Vance. Bailey shifted his weight. Known him long, we just met yesterday, Ruby admitted. Why do you ask? Just doing my job, Bailey said. New man comes to town, starts flashing money around. I like to know his story. Did you find anything concerning? Ruby asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. Bailey scratched his beard. No warrants out for him, if that's what you're asking. but men who wander into town alone and immediately take an interest in a pretty young woman, well, they sometimes have complicated pasts. Ruby felt a flash of defensiveness. He helped me when no one else would, Sheriff, and he mentioned he's bought land east of town. That's true enough, Bailey conceded. Purchase the old Wilson place fair and square. Just be careful, Ruby. Your father was a good man, and I'd hate to see you taken advantage of. After the sheriff departed, Ruby stood on the boardwalk for a long moment. The mention of her father stung Thomas McGrath had been respected in Reading, a skilled carpenter who had built half the structures in town before illness claimed him. His reputation had been all he left her, and Ruby guarded it fiercely. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a cooler breeze that hinted at the approaching winter. Ruby wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton garment that she had recently altered to match the current fashion. She sat through Reverend Miller's sermon with unusual impatience, her eyes frequently drifting to the church entrance. Zachary slipped in just as the service began, taking a seat at the back. Their eyes met briefly, and he offered a subtle nod that sent an unexpected flutter through Ruby's chest. After the service, as the congregation spilled onto the church steps for their weekly socializing, Ruby found herself surrounded by the usual well-meaning but pitying glances from the town's matrons. "Ruby, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, laying a plump hand on her arm. "I was just telling my Herbert that we could use some help with mending. Nothing regular, mind you, but if you're looking for extra work." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," Ruby replied with a practiced smile. "I'll keep that in mind." She was saved from further offers of charity by Zachary's approach. He had exchanged his usual trail-worn clothes for a clean white shirt and dark vest that highlighted his broad shoulders. "Miss McGrath," he said, removing his hat, "you look lovely today." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows shot up, and Ruby could practically feel the gossip beginning to circulate. "Mr. Vance," she acknowledged, "I'm glad you could make it to service. Would you care to join me for lunch at the hotel restaurant?" he asked. "I hear Mrs. Davis makes an excellent Sunday roast." The hotel restaurant was beyond Ruby's means, and she hesitated. "That's very kind, but I insist," Zachary said quietly. "Consider it a proper welcome to our acquaintance." Aware of the interested eyes around them, Ruby nodded. "Thank you, I'd be delighted." As they walked toward Reading's only hotel, Ruby was acutely conscious of the stares following them. Zachary seemed oblivious, or perhaps simply accustomed to such attention. "You've caused quite a stir," she observed as they entered the hotel's modest dining room. Zachary pulled out her chair. "Have I? A mysterious stranger befriending the town's poor seamstress. Mrs. Henderson will be telling everyone before sunset." His expression softened. "Does that bother you?" Ruby considered the question. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I've grown used to a certain kind of attention since my father died. This is different." The waiter appeared with menus, and Zachary ordered for them both after consulting with Ruby on her preferences. When they were alone again, he leaned forward slightly. "Sheriff Bailey paid me a visit yesterday," he said. "Seemed very interested in my intentions toward you." Ruby felt her cheeks flush. "He mentioned speaking with you. I'm sorry if he overstepped." "No need to apologize. It's good to see a town that looks after its own." Zachary took a sip of water. "Though I get the sense you're quite capable of looking after yourself." "I've had to be," Ruby replied. "When my father died, there weren't many options for a woman alone in Reading. I was fortunate Mrs. Wilson needed help." "What about family back east?" Ruby shook her head. "My mother died when I was small. My father brought me west when I was 19, hoping the climate would improve his health. There's no one left." "I'm sorry," Zachary said, and the genuine sympathy in his voice touched her. "And you?" she asked, eager to shift the focus. Do you have family? Something flickered across his face, a shadow of old pain quickly masked. Lost my parents in a fire when I was 14. My uncle took me in, but we didn't get along. I left when I was 16, found work with a cattle outfit moving herds north from Texas. Their food arrived, temporarily halting the conversation. Ruby realized she was genuinely hungry for the first time in days. The roast beef was tender, the potatoes perfectly seasoned, a far cry from her usual simple fare. As they ate, Zachary spoke of his years working cattle drives, of sleeping under the stars and facing down stampedes and rustlers. He described the land he'd purchased east of town, 200 acres with a small creek running through it, perfect for raising cattle. The cabin needs work, he admitted, but the bones are good. By spring, I should be ready to bring in my first herd. It sounds wonderful, Ruby said, genuinely impressed by his ambition. But won't you need help? Running a ranch isn't one man's job. You're right about that, he agreed. I've got savings to hire a couple of hands come spring. For now, I'm focusing on getting the place habitable and building corrals. After lunch, Zachary suggested a walk along the Sacramento River that flowed past the western edge of town. The afternoon was pleasant, the pathway relatively private. I appreciate the meal, Ruby said as they strolled, but I still intend to repay what you lent me. I know you do, Zachary replied. I wouldn't insult you by suggesting otherwise. They stopped at a bend in the river where the water moved slowly, reflecting the autumn colors of the trees. Why did you help me that day? Ruby asked the question that had been nagging at her since their first meeting. Zachary was quiet for a moment, skipping a stone across the water's surface. When I was 16 and on my own, I got caught in a blizzard in Wyoming. No shelter, no food, sure I was going to die. A Shoshone family found me half frozen and took me in. They didn't know me, had no reason to help a white boy, but they saved my life anyway. He looked at her directly. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places. Sometimes all we can do is pass it along when we see someone else in need. Ruby studied his face, searching for any sign of insincerity, but found none. That's a rare philosophy in these parts, Mr. Vance. Zachary, he reminded her with a smile, and maybe it is. But I've found it serves me well enough. As they walked back toward town, their conversation turned to lighter topics, books they had read, places they had seen. Ruby found herself laughing at his dry observations about Redding's characters, realizing it had been months since she had felt so at ease. When they reached her cabin, Zachary removed his hat. Thank you for a pleasant afternoon, Ruby. I enjoyed it too, she said honestly. I'll be in town most of next week getting supplies for the ranch. Perhaps we might see each other again, Ruby nodded. I'd like that. As she watched him walk away, Ruby felt a strange mixture of hope and caution. Zachary Vance was unlike any man she had met before, but experience had taught her that hope was a luxury she could ill afford. The next morning, Mrs. Wilson was full of questions that she tried to disguise as casual conversation. I hear you dined at the hotel yesterday, she said, measuring fabric for a new dress order. Word travels fast, Ruby observed, threading a needle. Small town, Mrs. Wilson replied with a shrug. This Vance fellow, he seems quite taken with you. Ruby concentrated on her stitching. We're merely acquaintances, Mrs. Wilson. The older woman was quiet for a moment. Well, he seems decent enough. Better than that Hallbrook boy who couldn't stop looking down your dress at the Founders' Day dance last year. Ruby laughed despite herself. Mrs. Wilson might be a gossip, but she was also perceptive and had been kind to Ruby when others offered only pity. Mr. Vance mentioned he's fixing up the old Wilson ranch, Ruby said, changing the subject slightly. That place has been empty for years, Mrs. Wilson remarked. Good land, though. My Albert always said it would make a fine cattle operation with the right investment. The bell over the door jingled, and both women looked up to see Mr. Perkins entering the shop. He nodded awkwardly at Ruby. "Miss McGrath, might I have a word, Mrs.?" Wilson raised an eyebrow but moved to the back of the shop, giving them some privacy while remaining within earshot. "What can I do for you, Mr. Perkins?" Ruby asked, setting aside her work. Perkins cleared his throat. "I wanted to apologize for my abruptness the other day. Business matters sometimes make me forget my manners." Ruby was taken aback. In the 3 years she had known him, Perkins had never apologized for anything. "That's quite all right," she said carefully. "The thing is," he continued, "I've been thinking about your situation. Your father was always prompt with the rent before his illness, and you've done your best since then." Ruby waited, uncertain where this was heading. "I've decided to reduce your monthly rent to $40, Perkins said. "And I'm willing to accept weekly payments if that suits your circumstances better." Ruby stared at him. "That's very generous, Mr. Perkins. May I ask what prompted this change of heart?" Perkins shifted uncomfortably. "Let's just say I was reminded of my Christian duty toward widows and orphans." From the back of the shop, Mrs. Wilson made a sound suspiciously like a snort. "Well, thank you," Ruby said sincerely. "That will make things considerably easier." After Perkins left, Mrs. Wilson returned, shaking her head. "Christian duty, indeed. I'd wager your Mr. Vance had words with him." "He's not my Mr. Vance," Ruby protested, though the possibility that Zachary had intervened on her behalf again made her feel both grateful and uncomfortable. She didn't want to be anyone's charity case, especially not his. That evening, as Ruby walked home with a basket of mending she'd taken on for extra income, she spotted Zachary outside the general store, loading supplies into a wagon. He saw her at the same moment and raised a hand in greeting. "Need a ride?" he called as she approached. "I'm just heading home," she replied. "It's not far." "That basket looks heavy," he observed, "and I'm headed that direction anyway. Got to pick up some tools from the blacksmith." Ruby hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, that would be helpful." He helped her onto the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her. The horse, a sturdy bay gelding, moved forward at Zachary's gentle command. "Did you speak to Mr. Perkins about my rent?" Ruby asked without preamble. Zachary gave her a sidelong glance. "Would it bother you if I had?" "Yes," she said honestly. "I don't need someone fighting my battles." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't threaten him, if that's what you're thinking. We had a conversation about fair business practices, that's all." "I appreciate your help with the payment," Ruby said, softening her tone. "But I need to stand on my own 2 feet. I can't have you intervening in my affairs." Zachary nodded slowly. "Fair enough. No more conversations with Perkins." They rode in silence for a moment before he spoke again. "You know, on a ranch, nobody stands alone. Even the toughest cowhand needs help sometimes. There's no shame in it." Ruby glanced at his profile, struck by the quiet certainty in his voice. "Perhaps, but I've learned that accepting help often comes with expectations." "Not from me," Zachary said simply. When they reached her cabin, he helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a brief moment, they stood close enough that Ruby could smell the leather and pine scent of him. "Thank you for the ride," she said, stepping back. "My pleasure." He tipped his hat. "I'm heading back to the ranch tomorrow, but I'll be in town again on Saturday. There's a social at the schoolhouse that evening, some fundraiser for new books. Would you consider attending with me?" Ruby hadn't been to a town social since before her father's death. The prospect was both appealing and daunting. "I'd need to check with Mrs. Wilson about my work schedule," she hedged. "Of course," Zachary said. "I'll stop by the shop on Saturday morning." After he left, Ruby entered her small cabin, suddenly seeing it through a stranger's eyes. The space was clean but sparse: a table and 2 chairs, a small stove, a narrow bed with a handmade quilt. Her few books and her mother's china teacup were the only decorative items. Yet it was hers, and she had fought hard to keep it. The next few days passed in a blur of work. The Brewster wedding preparations brought a flood of orders to Mrs. Wilson's shop, keeping Ruby busy from dawn until dusk. By Friday, her fingers were raw from needlework, but her purse was heavier than it had been in months. "You're coming to the social tomorrow, I hope, Mrs. Wilson said as they closed the shop. "The whole town will be there." "I'm not sure," Ruby replied. "There's still so much work to be done." Mrs. Wilson waved a dismissive hand. "The work will wait. You're young, Ruby. You shouldn't spend every evening alone with your needle and thread." When Ruby didn't respond, the older woman's expression softened. "Is it because of Mr. Vance? I hear he's asked to escort you." "News travels fast," Ruby said wryly. "It's a small town with big ears," Mrs. Wilson agreed, "but you shouldn't let gossip keep you from living your life." "It's not the gossip I'm worried about," Ruby admitted. I hardly know him." "And how will you get to know him if you don't spend time together?" Mrs. Wilson countered practically. "Besides, a public social is the perfect place for proper acquaintance. Everyone will be watching, no chance for impropriety." Ruby laughed despite herself. "Is that supposed to reassure me?" "Go to the social," Mrs. Wilson advised. "Wear your blue dress, it brings out your eyes. And remember, accepting an escort doesn't mean you're accepting a proposal." Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. Ruby spent extra time on her appearance, pinning her dark hair into a neat arrangement and adding a touch of rose water that she had been saving for a special occasion. The blue dress, freshly pressed, did indeed compliment her eyes, though she felt self-conscious in her best clothes after so many months of practical work attire. True to his word, Zachary appeared at the seamstress shop shortly after it opened. He was dressed in a clean white shirt and dark vest, his usual worn hat replaced by a newer one. "Good morning," he said, his eyes warming as they took in her appearance. "You look lovely, Ruby." "Thank you," she replied, feeling strangely shy. "I've decided I can attend the social this evening if your invitation still stands." "It does," he assured her. "I'll call for you at 6, Ruby nodded. "That would be fine." As promised, Zachary arrived at her cabin precisely at 6 o'clock. The afternoon had given Ruby ample time for second thoughts, but when she opened the door to find him standing there, hat in hand and a small bunch of wildflowers extended toward her, her doubts receded. "These aren't much," he said as she accepted the flowers. "But they reminded me of you managing to bloom despite the season." Ruby felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected compliment. "They're beautiful, thank you." She placed them in a jar of water, one of the few decorative items she possessed. "I'm ready whenever you are." The schoolhouse was already filled with people when they arrived. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the room. Tables laden with food lined one wall, while a small group of local musicians played lively tunes in the corner. Nearly everyone in Reading had turned out, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest miner. Ruby felt the curious stares as she entered on Zachary's arm, but he seemed either oblivious or unconcerned. He guided her toward the refreshment table, greeting those they passed with easy courtesy. "Ruby, so good to see you out and about," Mrs. Brewster exclaimed, her eyes darting between Ruby and Zachary with obvious curiosity. "And with company, too, Mrs. Brewster. This is Mr. Zachary Vance," Ruby introduced. "He's purchased the old Wilson ranch east of town." "Oh my, a rancher, Mrs. Brewster beamed. "We need more solid businessmen in these parts. My husband was just saying the other day that Reading's future depends on attracting the right sort of people. Before the conversation could become more awkward, Sheriff Bailey approached, nodding to the group. "Evening, folks." "Nice turnout for the school, Sheriff," Zachary acknowledged. "Good to see you again." Bailey's eyes traveled between Ruby and Zachary, his expression unreadable. "Likewise. Miss McGrath, would you mind if I borrowed your escort for a moment? Town business." Ruby glanced at Zachary, who gave a slight nod. "Of course, Sheriff, I'll just get some punch." As the men moved away, Mrs. Brewster leaned closer. "My dear, where did you find him? He's quite handsome and buying his own ranch. You've been keeping secrets." "There's no secret, Mrs. Brewster," Ruby said firmly. "Mr. Vance and I are merely acquaintances." "Well, he doesn't look at you like an acquaintance," Mrs. Brewster replied with a knowing smile. "And after everything you've been through, you deserve some happiness." Across the room, Ruby could see Zachary and the sheriff engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation. She tried not to stare, but curiosity got the better of her. "If you'll excuse me," she said to Mrs. Brewster, making her way toward the punch bowl, strategically located within earshot of the men's conversation. "Just want to be sure your intentions are honorable," Sheriff Bailey was saying. "Ruby's well respected in this town. Her father was a friend of mine." "I understand your concern," Zachary replied, his tone respectful but firm. "But Miss McGrath is a grown woman capable of making her own decisions. I've been nothing but transparent with her." "That may be so," Bailey conceded, "but a man with your background, my background—" Zachary interrupted, his voice dropping lower. Bailey sighed. "Word gets around, Vance. I know about Kansas City." Ruby froze, cup halfway to her lips. "What about Kansas City?" "Then you know I was cleared of all charges," Zachary said evenly. "And that the real culprits were caught 6 months later." "I know the official story," Bailey replied. "Just want to make sure there won't be any trouble following you to my town." "There won't be," Zachary assured him. "That chapter of my life is closed. I came to Reading for a fresh start, nothing more." Ruby quickly moved away before either man could notice her eavesdropping. Her mind raced with questions. What had happened in Kansas City? What charges had Zachary faced? She was still pondering this when Zachary rejoined her, offering an apologetic smile. "Sorry about that," he said. "The sheriff takes his duties seriously." "It's fine," Ruby replied, studying his face for any sign of what the conversation had really been about. "He's always looked out for me." The band struck up a lively tune, and couples began moving to the center of the room for a dance. "Would you care to dance?" Zachary asked, extending his hand. Ruby hesitated only briefly before accepting. "I should warn you, it's been a while." His hand was warm around hers as he led her to the dance floor. "Just follow my lead." The dance was a simple reel, nothing complicated, but Ruby found herself breathless by the end, partly from exertion, partly from the intensity of Zachary's gaze as he guided her through the steps. His hand at her waist was respectful but firm, his movements confident without being showy. As the evening progressed, they danced twice more, shared plate of Mrs. Davis's famous apple pie, and conversed with various townspeople. Ruby was surprised at how easily Zachary fit into the social fabric of Reading, his quiet charm winning over even the most skeptical observers. "You're good at this," she remarked as they stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The night was cool, stars brilliant in the clear sky above. "At what?" he asked. "Making people like you," Ruby said. Even Sheriff Bailey seemed to warm up by the end of the evening. Zachary smiled slightly. "I've moved around enough to know how important it is to become part of a community, especially when you plan to stay." "And do you?" "Plan to stay in Reading, I mean." He looked at her directly, the lantern light from the schoolhouse illuminating his features. "I do. I've spent too many years drifting. It's time to put down roots." Something in his tone made Ruby's heart beat faster. Before she could respond, the schoolhouse door opened and several couples spilled out, laughing and talking. "Shall we head back inside?" Zachary asked. "Or would you prefer to call it a night?" Ruby considered. It was getting late and she had early mass tomorrow. "Perhaps we should go. I've had a lovely time, but tomorrow comes early." Zachary nodded and offered his arm for the walk back to her cabin. They strolled in comfortable silence through the quiet streets of Reading, the sounds of the social fading behind them. When they reached her door, Ruby turned to face him. "Thank you for tonight. I can't remember the last time I enjoyed myself so much." "The pleasure was mine," Zachary replied, his voice low. He hesitated, then added, "Ruby, there's something I should tell you about what the sheriff mentioned earlier." Ruby felt a flicker of apprehension. "About Kansas City," surprise flashed across his face. "You heard?" "Not much," she admitted. "Just that there were charges and you were cleared." Zachary sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "5 years ago, I was working as a trail boss for a cattle company. We delivered a herd to Kansas City, and the night before we were to head back, the company's payment, nearly $10,000, was stolen from the hotel safe. I was accused because I had access to the room." His jaw tightened. "Spent 3 months in jail before a similar robbery occurred and the real thieves were caught. By then, my reputation was damaged, and the company didn't want me back." Ruby studied his face in the moonlight. "Why tell me this now?" "Because I want you to hear it from me, not as gossip," he said simply. "And because I find myself caring what you think of me." The honesty in his voice touched her. "Thank you for telling me." They stood in silence for a moment, the night air cool around them. Then slowly, Zachary leaned forward. Ruby knew he was going to kiss her, and she surprised herself by not pulling away. His lips were gentle against hers, the kiss brief but unmistakably tender. When he drew back, his eyes searched hers. "Good night, Ruby," he said softly. "Good night, Zachary," she whispered. She watched him walk away, her fingertips touching her lips where the warmth of his kiss lingered. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Ruby felt a spark of something that felt dangerously like hope. The following weeks brought a rhythm to Ruby's life that she hadn't experienced since before her father's illness. She worked at Mrs. Wilson's shop during the day, took on extra mending in the evenings, and saw Zachary whenever he came to town, typically twice a week for supplies or business. Their courtship, for Ruby had to admit that was what it was becoming, progressed with a deliberate pace that she found both reassuring and occasionally frustrating. Zachary was unfailingly respectful, never presuming more than she offered, yet the attraction between them grew with each meeting. In early November, he invited her to visit his ranch for the first time. "I've made good progress on the cabin," he told her as they shared coffee at the small cafe near the general store. "It's not fancy, but it's becoming livable. I'd like your opinion on it, a woman's perspective." Ruby hesitated. Visiting an unmarried man's home, even in daylight, would raise eyebrows in Reading. "I'm not sure that would be proper." "Mrs. Wilson could accompany us as chaperone," Zachary suggested, clearly having anticipated her concern. "Sunday after church, perhaps. I could bring the wagon." The idea of seeing where Zachary lived, of better understanding the life he was building, was too tempting to refuse. "I'll ask Mrs. Wilson if she's available." Mrs. Wilson, predictably, was delighted by the invitation. "Of course I'll come. I haven't seen that old place in years. Albert's cousin built it, you know, back in '58 during the gold rush." That Sunday, after church service, Zachary arrived with his wagon as promised. The day was crisp but sunny, perfect for a drive into the countryside. Ruby sat beside him on the seat with Mrs. Wilson perched behind them, chattering about the history of the Wilson property and peppering Zachary with questions about his plans for it. "You'll need to reinforce that north pasture fence before winter," she advised. "The creek floods every spring, and Albert's cousin lost half his herd one year when the fence washed out." "I appreciate the warning," Zachary said, steering the horses around a bend in the road. "I've already started work on that section." As they crested a small hill, the Wilson ranch came into view. Ruby's first impression was of potential rather than perfection. The main cabin sat on a gentle slope overlooking a meadow where the creek meandered through. Behind it, pine and oak forests climbed the hillside, providing natural shelter for livestock. The cabin itself was larger than Ruby had expected, a substantial log structure with a stone chimney and a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. Nearby stood a barn in need of repair, a corral, and several smaller outbuildings. "It's not much to look at yet," Zachary said as he helped the women down from the wagon. "But I've been focusing on making the house habitable first. The barn will be next." Inside, the cabin revealed Zachary's progress over the past weeks. The main room was clean and functional, with a stone fireplace, a solid wooden table with 4 chairs, and a few pieces of simple furniture. A hallway led to what appeared to be 2 bedrooms, and a small kitchen area occupied one corner of the main room. "You've done all this yourself?" Ruby asked, impressed by the craftsmanship evident in the refinished floors and newly constructed shelves. "Every bit, Mrs. Wilson confirmed before Zachary could answer. "Albert always said a man's work shows his character. These joints are tight as a drum, no shortcuts here." Ruby watched as Zachary accepted the praise with quiet dignity. There was something deeply appealing about a man who worked with his hands, who built rather than destroyed. "Come see the view from the porch," he invited, leading them outside to the back of the cabin. The vista that greeted them took Ruby's breath away. Rolling hills stretched toward distant mountains, the landscape painted in autumn golds and russets. Below, the creek reflected the blue sky, and a small herd of deer grazed peacefully at its edge. "It's beautiful," Ruby said softly. "I can see why you chose this place." Zachary nodded. "First time I rode up that hill and saw this view, I knew this was where I wanted to be." Mrs. Wilson, with surprising tact, mentioned checking the old fruit trees behind the barn, leaving Ruby and Zachary alone on the porch. "I can picture it," Ruby said after a moment. "What this will become when you're finished. A proper ranch with cattle grazing in that meadow, maybe horses in the corral." "I can picture it too," Zachary replied. "But in my vision, there's more to it than just livestock and buildings." Ruby glanced at him, catching the intent look in his eyes. "What else do you see?" "A home," he said simply. "Children playing by the creek, a garden behind the kitchen, someone to share it with." Her heart quickened at his words. "That's a lovely vision." "Ruby," Zachary began, turning to face her fully. "I know we haven't known each other long, but I found them," Mrs. Wilson called, interrupting as she rounded the corner of the cabin. 3 apple trees and a pear, all still bearing. We picked some for you." She thrust a small basket of fruit toward Zachary, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the moment she had interrupted. The drive back to Reading was quieter, with Mrs. Wilson dozing in the back of the wagon and Ruby lost in thought about what Zachary might have been about to say. When they reached town, he dropped Mrs. Wilson off first, then drove Ruby to her cabin. "Thank you for coming today," he said as he walked her to her door. "Having you there, seeing you in that space, it meant a lot to me." Ruby smiled. "I'm glad I came. Your ranch is going to be wonderful, Zachary." He caught her hand gently. "What I was trying to say earlier, I know," Ruby interrupted softly, "and I think I think I might want that too, but I need time. Zachary nodded, lifting her hand to his lips. I've got nothing but time, Ruby McGrath. As November gave way to December, Reading prepared for Christmas with its usual enthusiasm. The general store displayed imported candies and toys, the church organized a nativity pageant, and Mrs. Wilson's shop was overwhelmed with orders for new holiday clothes. Zachary continued his courtship, now openly acknowledged by both of them. He brought Ruby small gifts when he came to town: a book of poetry, a warm scarf he had purchased from a traveling peddler, a carved wooden box for her sewing notions that he had made himself during the long evenings at the ranch. For her part, Ruby began setting aside a portion of her earnings to repay Zachary's initial loan, though he never mentioned it. By mid-December, she had saved nearly the full amount, a fact that gave her immense satisfaction. One afternoon, as snow flurries danced outside the seamstress shop, Mrs. Wilson watched Ruby carefully finish a complicated embroidery pattern on a Christmas dress. "You've got a real gift, child," the older woman observed. "Have you given any thought to what you'll do next year?" Ruby glanced up, puzzled. "Next year? I assumed I'd continue working here if you'll have me." Mrs. Wilson hesitated. "The thing is, my sister in Sacramento has been after me to move there since Albert died. Her arthritis is getting worse, and she needs help with her boarding house." She fidgeted with a spool of thread. "I've been thinking it might be time to sell the shop." Ruby felt a jolt of alarm. The seamstress shop had been her lifeline these past months. "Oh, well, I understand, of course. Family comes first." "I'd like you to consider buying it," Mrs. Wilson said bluntly. "You've got the skill, and the ladies of Reading trust you. I wouldn't ask much, just enough to get me settled in Sacramento." Ruby stared at her employer in shock. "Me? Buy the shop? But I don't have that kind of money." "You could get a bank loan," Mrs. Wilson suggested. "Or perhaps—" She trailed off, but her glance toward the window where Zachary could be seen across the street at the general store made her meaning clear. "I couldn't ask him for that," Ruby said firmly. "Our relationship isn't. We're not." "Not yet, perhaps," Mrs. Wilson replied with a knowing smile. "But anyone with eyes can see where it's heading. I'm not suggesting you rush anything, mind you, just that you consider your options. I won't be leaving until spring at the earliest." The conversation left Ruby in turmoil. The idea of owning the shop was both thrilling and terrifying. It would mean true independence, a business of her own, everything she had secretly dreamed of but never thought possible. Yet the timing, with her relationship with Zachary developing as it was, complicated matters. That evening, when Zachary called on her as planned, Ruby was still distracted by Mrs. Wilson's proposal. "You're quiet tonight," he observed as they sat by the fire in her small cabin. "Something on your mind?" Ruby hesitated, then decided honesty was best. "Mrs. Wilson is thinking of selling the shop and moving to Sacramento in the spring." "I see," Zachary said carefully. "And that worries you, your position there?" "Actually, she suggested I buy it." Ruby watched his face for a reaction. "She thinks I could get a bank loan." Zachary was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful rather than surprised. "What do you think of the idea?" "I think I'd love to own the shop," Ruby admitted. "But it's a huge responsibility, and I'm not sure the bank would lend to a single woman with no collateral." "They might," Zachary said. "Especially with Mrs. Wilson's recommendation. You've built a good reputation in Reading." Ruby studied him curiously. "You sound supportive." "Should I not be?" he asked with a slight smile. "Most men wouldn't want there." She hesitated over the word. "Friend considering such an independent step." Zachary leaned forward, taking her hand in his. "Ruby, one of the things I admire most about you is your independence. Why would I want to diminish that?" Something warm unfurled in Ruby's chest at his words. Thank you for that. It means more than you know. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the fire crackling between them. I could lend you the money, Zachary offered quietly. If the bank refuses, Ruby shook her head immediately. No, that's kind, but no. This is something I need to do on my own if I do it at all. I understand, he said, and she believed he truly did. But the offer stands with no strings attached. 2 days before Christmas, as Ruby was closing the shop for the evening, Sheriff Bailey appeared at the door, his expression grave. "Ruby," he said, removing his hat. "Got a minute, of course, Sheriff," she replied, instantly alert to his serious tone. "Is something wrong?" Bailey glanced around the empty shop. "It's about Vance. Thought you should hear it from me first." Ruby's heart seemed to stop. "What about him?" "Has something happened?" "He's fine," Bailey assured her quickly. "But there was an incident at the saloon earlier. Vance was in town picking up supplies when 3 men rode in strangers. They recognized him, started making accusations." "What kind of accusations?" Ruby asked, her throat tight. Bailey shifted uncomfortably. "Called him a thief and a murderer. Said he'd killed a man in Kansas City and gotten away with it because he had friends in high places." Ruby's mind flashed back to Zachary's confession about being falsely accused of theft. He had mentioned nothing about murder. "There was a fight," Bailey continued. "Nothing serious. I broke it up before anyone got badly hurt. The strangers are spending the night in my jail to cool off, and Vance headed back to his ranch." "Did you ask him about their claims?" Ruby demanded. Bailey nodded slowly. "He didn't deny there was a death in Kansas City. Said it was self-defense during the robbery he told you about and that the court had cleared him." He hesitated. "Ruby, I checked into his story when he first came to town. There was indeed a trial and he was acquitted, but what?" She pressed. "The man who died was the son of a prominent rancher. There were rumors that evidence was suppressed, witnesses paid off. Nothing proven, mind you, but enough smoke to make folks wonder about fire." Ruby sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. "I don't believe it." "Zachary isn't a murderer." "I hope you're right," Bailey said gently. "But I thought you should know what's being said. Those men will be leaving town tomorrow, but talk like this has a way of spreading." After the sheriff left, Ruby sat alone in the darkening shop, her mind racing. Zachary had been honest about the theft accusation, but why hadn't he mentioned a death? And if he was truly innocent, why had these men tracked him down after all this time? She was still sitting there when a knock came at the door. "Expecting Mrs. Wilson," she called. "Come in." Instead, Zachary stepped inside, his face shadowed with fatigue and a darkening bruise along his jawline. He stopped short when he saw her expression. "You've heard," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Sheriff Bailey told me," Ruby confirmed, standing. "He said you were accused of murder." Zachary closed his eyes briefly. "I should have told you the whole story from the beginning." "Yes," Ruby agreed, her voice steadier than she felt. "You should have." He moved further into the room but maintained a respectful distance. "May I explain now?" Ruby gestured to the chair across from hers. "Please do." Zachary sat, removing his hat and placing it on his knee. "What I told you about Kansas City was true: the cattle drive, the stolen money, my arrest. What I didn't tell you was that during the robbery I confronted one of the thieves. There was a struggle, he pulled a knife, and in defending myself he was killed." His voice was flat, factual. "I didn't know until later that he was James Fletcher, son of Colonel Fletcher, one of the wealthiest ranchers in Missouri." "And the court acquitted you?" Ruby asked. "Yes, based on witness testimony that it was self-defense," Zachary confirmed. "But the Fletcher family never accepted the verdict. They still believe that I deliberately killed James and stole the money." "Did you?" The question slipped out before Ruby could stop it. Zachary's gaze met hers directly. "No, I've done things in my life I'm not proud of, Ruby, but I've never stolen a dollar that wasn't mine, and I've never killed a man except in self-defense. Ruby studied his face, the eyes that had never lied to her, the features she had come to know and care for deeply. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked. "At first, because I barely knew you," Zachary admitted. "Later, because I was afraid of how you'd look at me if you knew exactly the way you're looking at me now." Ruby realized she had drawn back unconsciously, putting distance between them. She forced herself to relax. "These men who came to town, were they sent by the Fletcher family?" Zachary nodded. "Bounty hunters, most likely. The Fletchers put out word they'd pay for information on my whereabouts. I thought I'd traveled far enough, changed enough to escape that shadow." His expression hardened. "I was wrong." "Will they come after you again?" Ruby asked, fear suddenly gripping her. "Possibly," Zachary acknowledged, "which is why I need to leave Redding." Ruby felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. "Leave? But your ranch is just land and timber," he said with a shake of his head. "Not worth risking more violence coming to this town. Not worth risking you getting caught in the middle of it. So you'll just run? Again?" Ruby couldn't keep the accusation from her voice. Zachary's jaw tightened. "What would you have me do? Stay and wait for more of Fletcher's men to show up? Maybe next time they won't bother with accusations, they'll just shoot first." "You could go to Sheriff Bailey, tell him everything," Ruby suggested. "He could write to the authorities in Kansas City, get official confirmation of your innocence." "I've tried that before," Zachary said wearily. "The law can't protect me from men like Fletcher, who believe their wealth puts them above justice." A heavy silence fell between them. Ruby's mind whirled with conflicting emotions: fear for Zachary's safety, anger at his omission, and beneath it all, a deep ache at the thought of him leaving. "When will you go?" she finally asked. "Tomorrow," he replied. At first light, Ruby nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Zachary stood, placing his hat back on his head. "I came to say goodbye, Ruby. And to tell you how sorry I am for not being completely honest, for bringing this trouble to your door, for having to leave when—" He stopped, visibly struggling with his emotions. "When I'd begun to hope for a future here, with you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch, placing it on the table between them. "I was going to give you this for Christmas, not as any kind of obligation, just as a token of how I feel." Before Ruby could respond, he moved to the door. "Goodbye, Ruby McGrath. I hope someday you can think of me kindly." As the door closed behind him, Ruby stared at the velvet pouch, tears blurring her vision. Slowly, she reached for it, tipping its contents into her palm. A delicate silver necklace slid out, with a small pendant in the shape of a rose, Ruby's namesake. The sight of it broke something inside her. Not just a gift, but a promise, one that would now go unfulfilled. She closed her fist around the necklace, pressing it to her heart as the tears came in earnest. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear, the streets of Redding dusted with fresh snow. Ruby moved through the day mechanically, helping Mrs. Wilson prepare the shop for the holiday closure, accepting invitations to Christmas dinner that she had no intention of keeping, and all the while watching the road east, wondering if Zachary was truly gone. That evening, as darkness fell, Ruby sat alone in her cabin, the Christmas candle in her window offering its small light to the night. She had placed Zachary's necklace around her throat, its weight a constant reminder of what might have been. A knock at her door startled her from her melancholy. Rising, she opened it to find Mrs. Wilson bundled against the cold, a small package in her gloved hands. "Merry Christmas, dear," the older woman said, stepping inside. "I thought you might want company tonight." Ruby managed a smile. "That's kind of you. I'm not very good company, I'm afraid." Mrs. Wilson patted her hand. "I heard about Mr. Vance leaving, The whole town's talking about it. Those men made quite a scene at the saloon." "I'm sure they are," Ruby said tiredly. "Sheriff Bailey sent a telegram to the authorities in Kansas City this morning, Mrs. Wilson continued, removing her coat. "Asked for official confirmation of Mr. Vance's story." Ruby looked up sharply. "He did. But Zachary's already gone." Mrs. Wilson's eyes twinkled. "Is he?" "Because I could have sworn I saw a light at his ranch when I passed by this afternoon on my way back from the Henderson farm." Hope flared in Ruby's chest, then quickly dimmed. "Even if he stayed, it doesn't change the fact that he hid the truth from me. Men are fools sometimes, Mrs. Wilson said pragmatically, "especially when they are in love. They think they are protecting us by keeping secrets when what we really need is honesty." Ruby fingered the silver rose at her throat. "I don't know what to do." "Don't you?" Mrs. Wilson raised an eyebrow. "Seems to me a woman who's ready to buy her own business and make her own way in the world should be able to figure out her own heart." After Mrs. Wilson left, Ruby sat by the fire for a long time, considering her options. If Zachary was still at the ranch, perhaps he hadn't given up completely. But even if he remained in Redding, the threat from the Fletchers wouldn't simply disappear. By midnight, Ruby had made her decision. She packed a small bag with essentials, wrapped herself in her warmest cloak, and stepped out into the Christmas Eve darkness. The livery stable was closed, but Mr. Peterson, who ran it, lived in rooms above. She knocked until lights appeared in the window. "Miss McGrath," Peterson asked groggily when he opened the door. "Is something wrong?" "I need to rent a horse," Ruby said firmly. "It's urgent." Peterson scratched his head. "On Christmas Eve? Can't it wait till morning?" "It cannot," Ruby insisted, reaching into her purse for payment. "Please, Mr. Peterson. It's important." Something in her expression must have convinced him, for he nodded and reached for his coat. "Give me a few minutes to saddle something for you. You can ride, I assume." "My father taught me," Ruby confirmed, though it had been years since she'd been on horseback. 20 minutes later, she was mounted on a gentle mare, heading east out of Redding toward Zachary's ranch. The night was bitterly cold, but the sky was clear, stars and a nearly full moon illuminating the snow-covered road. Ruby rode slowly, mindful of the ice that might lurk beneath the snow, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the ranch, far longer than it would have in daylight with a faster pace. As Mrs. Wilson had suggested, a light glowed in the cabin's window, a beacon in the darkness. Ruby's heart pounded as she dismounted, tethering the mare to the porch rail before approaching the door. She knocked firmly, then stepped back, suddenly uncertain. What if Zachary had changed his mind? What if he didn't want to see her? The door swung open, and there he stood, shock evident on his face. "Ruby, what in God's name are you doing here? It's the middle of the night. You didn't leave," she said, her voice trembling slightly from cold and emotion. Zachary's expression softened. "I couldn't. Not without." He trailed off, then stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze." The cabin was warm, the fireplace blazing. Ruby moved toward it gratefully, removing her gloves to warm her numbed fingers. "What are you doing here?" Zachary asked again, bringing her a blanket to wrap around her shoulders. Ruby turned to face him. "I came to tell you that running away isn't the answer, not for you and not for us." "Ruby," Zachary began, his voice pained. "The danger is real. Fletcher won't stop, then we'll face it," Ruby interrupted. "Together." "Sheriff Bailey has sent to Kansas City for official confirmation of your innocence. Once we have that, we can fight these accusations properly." Zachary shook his head. "It's not that simple. Fletcher has money, influence, and you have truth," Ruby countered, "and people who believe in you." "Me, Sheriff Bailey, Mrs. Wilson more than you know." He stared at her for a long moment. Why would you take such a risk? For me?" Ruby stepped closer, lifting her hand to his face, her fingers tracing the bruise along his jaw where one of Fletcher's men had struck him. "Because I love you," she said simply. "And love is worth fighting for." Zachary caught her hand, pressing it more firmly against his cheek. "I love you too," he whispered. "More than I ever thought possible, but I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me." "Nothing will happen to either of us," Ruby said with more confidence than she felt. "We'll face whatever comes, but we'll face it together." Zachary's arms wrapped around her then, pulling her against his chest in an embrace that spoke more eloquently than words of his fear, his love, his hope. Ruby held him just as tightly, her face pressed to his shoulder, breathing in the scent that had become so dear to her. "Marry me," he said suddenly, drawing back to look into her eyes. "Not someday, not when everything is perfect now, tomorrow, Christmas Day." Ruby caught her breath. "So soon?" "Life is uncertain," Zachary said. "These past few days have reminded me of that. I don't want to waste another moment wondering what might have been." His hands framed her face gently. "I love you, Ruby McGrath. Will you be my wife?" Ruby's heart swelled with a joy so intense it was almost painful. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." His kiss was tender at first, then deepening with a passion that made her dizzy. When they finally drew apart, both breathing hard, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. "I should take you back to town," he said reluctantly. "It's not proper for you to be here alone with me, especially if we're to be married tomorrow." Ruby laughed softly. "I think we've moved well beyond concern for proprieties, don't you? Besides, it's Christmas Eve, and I've ridden 2 hours through snow to get here. I'm not going anywhere tonight." Zachary's smile was slow and warm. "In that case, I offer you my bed. I'll take the chair by the fire." "Such a gentleman," Ruby teased, though she was grateful for his respect. "But I think the fire is warm enough for both of us to sit by for a while." They spent the night talking, truly talking, without secrets or evasions. Zachary told her everything about Kansas City, about his life before Reading, about his hopes and fears. Ruby shared her own history, her dreams for the seamstress shop, her loneliness since her father's death. As dawn broke on Christmas morning, they finally dozed off, Ruby curled in Zachary's arms on the rug before the fire. They were awakened by a sharp knock at the door. Zachary was instantly alert, gently moving Ruby aside as he stood and reached for the rifle propped near the fireplace. "Who's there?" he called. "Sheriff Bailey," came the response. "And Reverend Miller." "Open up, Vance." Zachary and Ruby exchanged alarmed glances before he moved to open the door. Sheriff Bailey stood on the porch, his expression unreadable, with Reverend Miller behind him looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Sheriff," Zachary acknowledged cautiously. "Reverend, what brings you out here on Christmas morning?" Bailey's eyes moved past Zachary to Ruby, who had wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and stood near the fire. His eyebrows rose slightly, but he made no comment on her presence. "Got a reply to my telegram," the sheriff said, holding up a piece of paper. "Came in late last night. Thought you'd want to see it right away." Zachary accepted the telegram, reading it quickly, his expression shifting from tension to disbelief. "What does it say?" Ruby asked, moving to his side. "It's from the Kansas City Marshal," Zachary said, his voice rough with emotion. "Confirming that I was fully acquitted of all charges related to James Fletcher's death, and that new evidence came to light 6 months ago proving conclusively that I was not involved in the theft." He looked up at Bailey. "How is this possible? The Fletcher family buried that evidence." "Seems Colonel Fletcher passed away last spring," Bailey explained. "His younger son took over the family business and apparently had doubts about his brother's activities. He ordered a private investigation that turned up proof the money was stolen by James and two accomplices. The families retracted all claims against you, Vance. Zachary stared at the telegram, his hand shaking slightly. It's over, he whispered. After 5 years, it's finally over. Ruby slipped her arm around his waist, leaning against him in silent support. There's more, Bailey continued. Those men who came looking for you. They're not working for the Fletchers. They're common bounty hunters who heard rumors and thought they might squeeze some money out of the situation. They've been run out of town with a warning not to return. Thank you, Sheriff, Zachary said sincerely. For everything. Bailey nodded, then cleared his throat awkwardly. Now about the current situation. Reverend Miller stepped forward. What the sheriff is trying to say, Mr. Vance, is that Miss McGrath's presence here, unchaperoned, has been noted. Mrs. Peterson at the livery mentioned her departure last night, and, well, in a small town like Reading, we're getting married today, Ruby interrupted, lifting her chin. We had already decided before you arrived. Is that so? Bailey asked, looking to Zachary for confirmation. It is, Zachary agreed firmly, if the Reverend is willing to perform the ceremony. Reverend Miller looked between them, then nodded slowly. I suppose that would resolve the immediate concern for propriety. Though typically there would be banns read, special circumstances, Bailey interjected. I think we can make an exception, considering it's Christmas Day. He looked at Ruby and Zachary with a hint of a smile. Unless you'd prefer to wait. No, they said in unison, then laughed, the tension breaking. Very well, Reverend Miller said. Shall we say noon at the church? That will give you time to. He gestured vaguely at their rumpled appearance, prepare appropriately. After the men left, Ruby turned to Zachary, suddenly overwhelmed by the rapid turn of events. Are we really doing this? Getting married today? Zachary took her hands in his. Only if you're certain, Ruby. We can wait if you'd prefer. Ruby shook her head, smiling. No, I don't want to wait. But I don't have a proper dress. Or, you'll be beautiful in whatever you wear, Zachary assured her. But I should get you back to town so you can change and gather whatever you need. The ride back to Reading was jubilant, despite the cold. Word of their impending marriage had somehow preceded them, and as they passed the general store, the owner called out congratulations. By the time Ruby reached her cabin, Mrs. Wilson was already waiting on the porch, a knowing smile on her face. I might have mentioned to Reverend Miller that you'd ridden out to the Vance ranch last night, the older woman admitted without a trace of remorse. Figured you two might need a push in the right direction. Ruby laughed, embracing her friend. Thank you for everything, Mrs. Wilson patted her back. Now, let's get you ready for a wedding. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Mrs. Wilson produced a cream-colored dress that Ruby had been altering for another customer. She won't mind, not for this, and with a few quick adjustments it fit perfectly. Her dark hair was arranged in an elegant knot, adorned with sprigs of winter berries and pine that Mrs. Wilson declared perfectly festive for a Christmas bride. The small church was surprisingly full when Ruby arrived. It seemed that half of Reading had decided that a Christmas Day wedding was the perfect entertainment. Sheriff Bailey stood beside Zachary at the altar, serving as best man, while Mrs. Wilson took her place as Ruby's matron of honor. Zachary turned as Ruby walked down the aisle, and the look of wonder on his face made her heart swell. He had somehow acquired a new shirt and tie, his hair neatly combed beneath a freshly brushed hat that he removed as she approached. Reverend Miller's ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. When it came time to exchange rings, Zachary surprised Ruby by producing a simple gold band. It was my mother's, he whispered as he slipped it onto her finger. The only thing I saved when our home burned. Ruby, having no ring to offer in return, impulsively removed the silver rose necklace from her throat. "Hold out your hand," she instructed Zachary, and when he did, she placed the pendant in his palm, closing his fingers around it. "Until I can give you a proper ring, carry this as a token of my love." Their first kiss as husband and wife was met with enthusiastic applause from the assembled townspeople. As they turned to face their impromptu guests, Ruby was struck by the genuine warmth in the faces around them. Somehow, in the midst of grief and struggle, she had found not just love but community in Reading. The celebration moved to the hotel restaurant, where Mrs. Davis had hastily prepared a wedding feast supplemented by dishes brought by well-wishers. There was dancing and toasting, laughter and a few happy tears. Ruby found herself passed from one congratulatory embrace to another, her cheeks aching from smiling. As evening approached, Zachary found her amidst the crowd, his hand warm at the small of her back. "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his voice low in her ear. The name, her new name, sent a thrill through Ruby. "Yes," she whispered back. "Take me home." They said their goodbyes amid knowing smiles and a few good-natured jests, then rode together toward the ranch that was now their shared home. The winter stars sparkled overhead, the night crisp and clear, as if the heavens themselves were celebrating their union. When they reached the cabin, Zachary lifted Ruby from her horse and carried her across the threshold, both of them laughing at the traditional gesture. Inside, she saw that he had prepared for their return. Fresh candles lit the room, the fire blazed warmly, and the bed in the main bedroom had been made up with clean linens and extra blankets against the cold. "When did you do all this?" Ruby asked, amazed. "This morning while you were getting ready in town," Zachary admitted. "I may have recruited some help from the Petersons' eldest boy." Ruby turned in his arms, suddenly shy despite her happiness. "It's perfect." Zachary brushed a strand of hair from her face, his expression growing serious. "Ruby, I want you to know I'll never keep anything from you again. No secrets, no half-truths. You have my word." "And I promise to always believe in you," Ruby replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "To stand with you, whatever comes." Their kiss deepened, the months of restrained desire finally finding expression. Ruby felt herself trembling, not with fear but with anticipation, as Zachary's hands moved to the buttons of her dress. "I love you, Ruby Vance," he murmured against her lips. "And I love you, Zachary Vance," she answered, surrendering herself to the promise of their future together. Spring arrived in Reading with its usual exuberance, the hills around the town exploding into green and gold, wildflowers carpeting the meadows. At the Vance Ranch, the transformation was even more dramatic. The winter had been spent in constant work repairing the barn, reinforcing fences, ordering supplies for the cattle that would arrive with the warming weather. Ruby had thrown herself into creating a home with the same determination she brought to everything. The cabin now boasted curtains at the windows, a vegetable garden beginning to sprout behind the kitchen, and comfortable furniture that made the main room a welcoming gathering place. She had continued working at the seamstress shop through the winter, saving every penny toward eventually purchasing it from Mrs. Wilson. "I could still lend you the money," Zachary offered one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of amber and rose. Ruby shook her head, smiling. "We've had this conversation, husband. I want to do this myself." "Stubborn woman," Zachary said fondly, pulling her closer against his side. "You knew that when you married me," she reminded him. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look up. Sheriff Bailey appeared on the ridge, riding toward the cabin at a leisurely pace. "Evening, Sheriff," Zachary called as Bailey dismounted. "What brings you out our way?" Just delivering the mail, Bailey replied, climbing the porch steps. Express rider brought this for you marked urgent. He handed Zachary a thick envelope bearing the seal of a Kansas City law firm. Ruby felt her husband tense beside her. "Thank you, Tom," Zachary said, his voice carefully neutral. Bailey nodded, glancing between them. "Everything all right out here? Cattle arriving next week as planned?" "Everything's fine," Ruby assured him, though her eyes were on Zachary's face as he examined the envelope. "Would you like to stay for supper? I've got a stew on." "Thanks, but I should get back to town," Bailey declined. "Just wanted to deliver that personally, given its origin." After the sheriff departed, Zachary continued to stare at the unopened envelope. Ruby laid a gentle hand on his arm. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together," she reminded him. "No more secrets, remember?" Zachary nodded and broke the seal. Inside were several documents which he scanned quickly, his expression shifting from wariness to astonishment. "What is it?" Ruby prompted. "It's from Fletcher's lawyers," Zachary said, his voice stunned. "Matthew Fletcher, the younger son, He handed her the letter, too overwhelmed to continue. Ruby read it quickly, her own eyes widening. "As restitution for the false accusations against you and the damages to your reputation and livelihood, the Fletcher family offers compensation in the amount of $5,000, along with a public retraction of all claims." She looked up at Zachary in shock. $5,000. "That's a fortune," Zachary finished. "More money than I've seen in my entire life." Ruby continued reading. "Additionally, Mr. Matthew Fletcher wishes to extend a personal apology for his family's actions and would welcome correspondence regarding potential business opportunities between his cattle operation and your own." They stared at each other in disbelief. "It doesn't seem real," Ruby whispered. "No, it doesn't," Zachary agreed. He took the letter back, reading it again as if to convince himself of its authenticity. "What do we do with this kind of money?" Ruby's mind raced with possibilities. "The seamstress shop," she began. "Of course," Zachary said immediately. "You'll buy it from Mrs. Wilson." "And we could expand the ranch sooner than planned," Ruby added. "Bring in more cattle, hire those hands you mentioned." Zachary nodded slowly, the shock beginning to give way to excitement. "We could build a proper house, something bigger than this cabin." "I like this cabin," Ruby protested. "It's our first home." "Then we'll keep it," Zachary compromised. "Use it as a guest house when we build the main house. Maybe start thinking about filling those extra bedrooms." He gave her a meaningful look that made her blush. "We've only been married 4 months," she reminded him, though the idea of their children filled her with a warmth she couldn't deny. "4 wonderful months," Zachary said, pulling her into his arms. "The first of many, many more." The following week, as promised, the cattle arrived, 50 head of prime Hereford stock that would form the foundation of the Vance Ranch. Zachary had hired 2 experienced hands to help manage the herd, with plans to expand further as the operation grew. Ruby, meanwhile, had approached Mrs. Wilson with a formal offer to purchase the seamstress shop. The older woman had accepted with delight, relieved to be able to join her sister in Sacramento without worry about the business she had built. "You'll do well with it," Mrs. Wilson predicted as they signed the papers transferring ownership. "You've got a good head for business and skilled hands for the work. That's a rare combination." Ruby smiled, still hardly believing that at 23 she was a business owner. "I've had good teachers," she said, thinking of both Mrs. Wilson and her father who had taught her the value of honest work. "Will you keep living out at the ranch?" Mrs. Wilson asked. "It's quite a ride into town each day." "For now," Ruby confirmed. "Once the business is established, I'll look for someone to help manage it, perhaps train an apprentice." but I want to be hands-on until everything is running smoothly. The arrangement meant long days for Ruby, riding into town each morning and returning to the ranch each evening, but she thrived on the challenge. The seamstress shop, now renamed Ruby's Fine Sewing and Alterations, quickly became known for quality work and fair prices, attracting customers from as far away as the surrounding towns. Zachary, for his part, threw himself into developing the ranch with the same methodical dedication he brought to everything. By midsummer, the Vance cattle were thriving. The corrals and barns stood strong and newly painted, and construction had begun on what would eventually be their main house, a comfortable two-story structure positioned to take advantage of the creek view. One warm August evening, as they sat on the porch of the cabin enjoying a rare moment of leisure, Ruby noticed Zachary watching her with an odd expression. "What is it?" she asked, self-consciously touching her hair. "Do I have flour on my face from baking?" Zachary shook his head, smiling. "No, you're perfect. I was just thinking about the day we met you counting your coins, Perkins demanding his money, me stepping in." Ruby laughed softly. "I was so suspicious of you, I couldn't understand why a stranger would help me. And now," Zachary prompted. "Now I understand that some men are simply good," Ruby replied, reaching for his hand. "That kindness doesn't always come with conditions. That love can grow from the most unexpected beginnings." Zachary brought her hand to his lips. "I think about how easily it could have all gone differently. If I hadn't been passing by at that exact moment, or if I'd been too proud to accept your help," Ruby added. "Or if I'd left Redding when those bounty hunters showed up," Zachary continued. Ruby squeezed his hand. "But none of those things happened. You helped me, I accepted, you stayed. And now here we are." "Here we are," Zachary agreed, his voice soft with wonder. "Owner of a growing ranch, married to the most beautiful seamstress in California, building a future I never thought I'd have." Ruby leaned against his shoulder, contentment washing over her like the golden evening light that bathed the landscape around them. "Do you remember what you told me that day by the river, about the Shoshone family that helped you during the blizzard?" Zachary nodded. "That sometimes help comes from unexpected places, that all we can do is pass it along." "I've been thinking about that," Ruby said. "About how we might pass along the good fortune we've received. The Fletcher money is more than enough for the shop and the ranch and the new house." "What did you have in mind?" Zachary asked, curious. Ruby had been considering this for weeks, ever since they had received the unexpected windfall. "What about a scholarship fund? For children who have lost parents like we both did. Something to help them get an education, learn a trade." Zachary was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "The Thomas McGrath Memorial Fund," he suggested, "in honor of your father." Ruby felt her throat tighten with emotion. That would be wonderful. He always believed in education, even though he didn't have much himself. "We'll set it up through the school," Zachary decided. "Make sure it helps those who truly need it." Ruby turned to kiss him, her heart full of love for this man who understood her so completely. "Thank you," she whispered against his lips. As the kiss deepened, Zachary pulled her onto his lap, his arms encircling her waist. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he studied her face in the fading light. "I have something to tell you," he said, his voice carrying an odd note that made Ruby sit up straighter. "What is it?" she asked, suddenly apprehensive. "Is something wrong?" Zachary shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Nothing's wrong. But I spoke with Dr. Miller when I was in town yesterday, had a bit of a stomachache, nothing serious." "And?" Ruby prompted, confused by the seeming non sequitur. "And he asked some interesting questions about your health lately, whether you'd been tired, queasy in the mornings, that sort of thing." Zachary's eyes held hers, full of barely contained excitement. "Ruby, he thinks you might be expecting." Ruby's hand flew to her stomach, her mind racing back over the past weeks, the unusual fatigue, the aversion to coffee she usually enjoyed, the gentle swelling of her waist that she had attributed to Mrs. Davis's excellent cooking. "A baby," she whispered, awe and terror mingling in her voice. "But how did Dr. Miller know? I haven't even seen him." "Apparently Mrs. Wilson mentioned to him that you looked a bit peaky at the shop last week," Zachary explained, "and he put that together with what I was describing about my own symptoms, which he thinks are just nerves, by the way." Ruby laughed shakily. "This town and its gossip. I can't even have a baby without everyone knowing before I do." "Are you happy about it?" Zachary asked, suddenly uncertain. "I know we talked about waiting a while until the ranch was more established." "I'm thrilled," Ruby interrupted, tears springing to her eyes. "Scared but thrilled." "Oh, Zachary, a baby, our baby." He gathered her close, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Our family," he murmured into her hair. "Our future." As they sat together in the gathering dusk, planning and dreaming, Ruby thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a desperate young woman counting insufficient coins to a successful business owner and rancher's wife, expecting their first child. From a man haunted by false accusations to one building a legacy of honesty and hard work. All because her landlord had demanded payment she couldn't give, and a cowboy had handed over the money without hesitation. A simple act of kindness that had changed everything. In March of the following year, Ruby gave birth to a healthy son they named Thomas Zachary Vance, in honor of her father and his. The baby arrived just as the first spring calves were being born, a time of renewal and promise that seemed fitting for this new life. By then, the main house was complete, a comfortable home with plenty of room for the growing family they both hoped for. Ruby had trained a young woman from town to help manage the seamstress shop, allowing her to split her time between business and family. The Thomas McGrath Memorial Fund had already helped 3 children continue their education beyond what would otherwise have been possible. On their son's christening day, as friends and neighbors gathered to celebrate, Sheriff Bailey pulled Zachary aside. "You've built something good here, Vance," the sheriff observed, looking around at the prosperous ranch, the beautiful home, the happy guests. "Something that'll last." Zachary followed his gaze to where Ruby stood on the porch, their son cradled in her arms as she chatted with Mrs. Wilson, who had returned from Sacramento for the occasion. "I got lucky," Zachary said simply. Bailey shook his head. "Luck's part of it, sure, but you also had the courage to stay when running would have been easier, to fight for what you wanted instead of letting fear decide your path." "We both did," Zachary corrected, thinking of Ruby's midnight ride to his ranch that Christmas Eve, her determination to stand with him against whatever came. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and Thomas was sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Ruby and Zachary stood together on the porch of their new home, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Happy?" Zachary asked, his arm around her waist. Ruby leaned into his embrace, contentment filling her like the sweet spring air that surrounded them. "Completely," she affirmed. "And you?" "More than I ever thought possible," he replied honestly. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life, our life." "That afternoon in Redding when I saw Perkins confronting you, I had no idea where that small kindness would lead." Ruby turned in his arms, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "To hear," she whispered against his lips, "it led us home." Above them, the stars of Redding, California shone down on the Vance ranch, on the cattle sleeping in the pastures, on the new house with its warm windows glowing in the darkness, on the small family that had found in each other the courage to believe in second chances and the strength to build a future neither had dared to imagine. For Ruby and Zachary Vance, it was only the beginning.